What if the Cleveland Browns' next head coach isn't just asking for a bigger paycheck, but total control of the franchise? Not partial influence, not shared power, everything. And what if the reason that demand even exists comes down to one name that keeps pulling this organization into the national spotlight, whether people like it or not? Because according to insiders, this isn't just another off-season rumor. This is about leverage, relevance, and a quarterback who's already changed how the Browns are talked about long before proving anything on the field. And that's where things start getting uncomfortable. A respected Browns insider recently laid out exactly what it would take for John Harbaugh to even consider coaching in Cleveland. We're talking about massive money, unprecedented authority, and a complete reshaping of how this franchise operates. That alone would be headline-worthy. But when you connect it to Shedeur Sanders, the conversation shifts from hypothetical to explosive. Here's the truth most fans don't want to admit. The Browns are being discussed right now for one reason: not wins, not playoff runs, not roster construction. It's because Shedeur Sanders is in the building. His presence alone has made Cleveland relevant in a way they haven't been in years. And in an NFL that runs on attention just as much as results, that matters more than people want to say out loud. This isn't just about football anymore. It's about entertainment, power, and whether Cleveland is finally willing to hand the keys to someone who demands full control in exchange for changing everything. Some fans love the idea, others hate it. But either way, this story isn't going away. Because once a franchise starts being talked about for the wrong reasons and the right reasons at the same time, big moves usually follow. And what's being whispered behind the scenes right now could completely reshape the Browns' future. This entire discussion shifted the moment a trusted Browns voice stopped speaking in hypotheticals and started listing conditions. Not opinions, not fan wishes, actual requirements. According to Browns insider Tony Grossi, there's a very specific checklist that would have to be met for John Harbaugh to even entertain the idea of coming to Cleveland. And it's not small. We're talking about a salary in the neighborhood of $20 million per year, a massive assistant coaching budget that rivals the top programs in the league, and most importantly, full authority over the roster. Not influence, not collaboration, control. The ability to shape the team, the draft philosophy, and the personnel structure without fighting internal politics. That alone would represent a complete departure from how the Cleveland Browns have traditionally operated. This organization has spent years balancing power between ownership, front office, and coaching staff, often with messy results. Harbaugh's reported demands would blow that structure up entirely. What makes this revelation so jarring is that it doesn't sound like leverage posturing. It sounds like clarity. Harbaugh isn't asking to fix Cleveland within their existing system. He's saying the system itself is the problem. And if he's going to attach his reputation to another franchise, he wants the freedom to do it his way. Insiders have also pointed out that Cleveland isn't even Harbaugh's top hooking point right now. Other teams are reportedly in the mix. But the Browns remain in the conversation for one reason: desperation mixed with opportunity. Cleveland has tried every safe hire imaginable: experienced coordinators, analytical darlings, culture builders, and every version has collapsed under the same weight. That's why these demands, as extreme as they sound, aren't being dismissed outright inside the building. When a franchise keeps failing the same way, the definition of reasonable starts to change. And then there's the detail that makes this impossible to ignore. Harbaugh doesn't just want control for control's sake. He wants to build around a quarterback he believes in, a quarterback he can align the entire roster around. Which brings this conversation back to the same name Cleveland can't escape right now. Because once Harbaugh's conditions became public, one question started circulating quietly behind the scenes. Is this about power, or is it about who he wants to coach next? Here, where this story stops being about coaching contracts and starts being about gravity. Because whether people want to admit it or not, Shedeur Sanders is the reason Cleveland is even part of this conversation. A Browns insider said it plainly, and it ruffled a lot of feathers. The reason people are talking about the Cleveland Browns right now isn't because they're winning games. It's not because of playoff positioning or roster brilliance. It's because Shedeur Sanders is on the team. Full stop. That might sound harsh to traditional football fans, but it's not wrong. Every other quarterback situation in Cleveland over the last decade came and went quietly. Even first-round picks eventually faded into background noise. Shedeur didn't. From the moment he arrived, national conversations followed. Media coverage increased. Social engagement spiked. Suddenly, Cleveland was being discussed on shows that normally ignore them entirely. And that matters in today's NFL more than people like to admit. This league isn't just about wins and losses anymore. It's an entertainment business that runs on attention, relevance, and narrative. A quarterback with millions of followers, constant media interest, and built-in controversy changes the value of a franchise overnight. Insiders aren't guessing here. They're acknowledging reality. Shedeur brings eyeballs even when the team loses. He brings debate even when he doesn't play. That's rare. And for an organization that's struggled to stay relevant outside of chaos, that kind of presence becomes leverage whether they asked for it or not. This is also why the reaction to Shedeur is so polarized. Some fans want to talk purely about stats and development timelines. Others see the bigger picture. The Browns aren't just evaluating a quarterback, they're managing attention. And in a market starved for optimism, Shedeur represents something Cleveland hasn't had in years, a reason for people to care again. That doesn't mean he's guaranteed success. It doesn't mean he's untouchable, but it does mean decisions around him are magnified. Every coaching hire, every offensive direction, every long-term plan suddenly has to account for his presence. And this is where John Harbaugh's name keeps resurfacing. Because if you're going to build around a quarterback who brings that level of attention, you need a coach with authority, credibility, and the ability to drown out noise. That's why this conversation won't die. Because as long as Shedeur Sanders remains the focal point, Cleveland's next move won't be subtle. And the bigger his shadow grows, the harder it becomes to pretend this is just another rebuild. This is where the conversation takes a sharp turn, because the push for John Harbaugh isn't coming from nostalgia or blind faith. It's coming from precedent, a very specific one that still makes people uncomfortable when they remember how it started. Before Lamar Jackson became an MVP, there was a loud segment of the football world that didn't believe in him. He was labeled raw, questioned as a real quarterback, treated like a project that would only work if everything around him was perfect. Sound familiar? What separated Lamar's story from so many others wasn't just talent, it was alignment. Harbaugh didn't try to force Lamar into an existing system. He tore the system down and rebuilt it around what Lamar did best. The roster changed. The offense evolved. The philosophy shifted. And once that happened, the doubts disappeared almost overnight. That's the blueprint people inside Cleveland keep circling back to. Because Shedeur Sanders is facing a different version of the same skepticism. Not about athleticism, but about image, about polish, about whether he's too much, too visible, too talked about, too attached to a famous name. Those doubts aren't always said out loud, but they shape how quarterbacks are developed and supported. Harbaugh's appeal is that he doesn't flinch in those moments. He's proven he can tune out narratives and focus on structure. He understands that quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. Systems fail them first. And that belief is exactly what makes his reported demands make sense. Total roster control isn't about ego. It's about removing friction. It's about ensuring the quarterback, the scheme, and the personnel are moving in the same direction. That's how Lamar went from doubted to dominant. And that's why people see the same potential framework with Shedeur, not because they're the same player, but because the environment matters just as much as the talent. Cleveland has never fully committed to that kind of alignment. They've hedged, they've compromised, they've tried to make quarterbacks adapt instead of adapting for them. The result has been predictable. That's why Harbaugh's name keeps resurfacing in this conversation. He represents a proven model for taking a polarizing quarterback and turning him into a franchise cornerstone, not by silencing critics, but by building something that makes criticism irrelevant. And once that idea takes root inside a front office, it's hard to shake, because it forces a brutal question. What if the Browns' biggest failure hasn't been drafting the wrong quarterbacks, but refusing to build the right structure around them? This is where the idea starts making people uneasy, because bringing in John Harbaugh under those conditions wouldn't just change the Browns, it would expose them. Harbaugh's reported demands don't fit neatly into Cleveland's current structure, and that's the point. Full roster control, authority over personnel, a hand-picked decision-maker to lean on. That kind of power instantly shifts who really runs the franchise. And historically, Cleveland hasn't handled those shifts well. The Browns have spent years trying to balance voices: ownership, front office, analytics, coaching staff. Everyone gets a say, and when things go wrong, accountability gets blurry. That model sounds collaborative on paper, but in reality, it's often paralyzing. Decisions get delayed, philosophies clash, and quarterbacks end up caught in the middle. That's exactly what Harbaugh would be trying to eliminate. From his perspective, if he's going to attach his name to another rebuild, he's not doing it halfway. He's not walking into a situation where he has to sell his vision internally before executing it on Sundays. He wants alignment from the top down, because he's already lived through what happens without it. For Cleveland, that demand creates a dilemma. Saying yes means admitting the current structure isn't working. It means surrendering control they've been reluctant to give up, even as results continue to disappoint. Saying no, on the other hand, means passing on a coach with a proven track record of developing quarterbacks in unconventional situations. And that's where Shedeur Sanders becomes impossible to separate from the decision. If the Browns believe Shedeur is just another option, they can afford to play it safe. Keep the structure. Hire a more traditional coach. Let development play out. But if they believe he has real franchise potential, hesitation becomes dangerous, because quarterbacks don't develop in a vacuum. They develop within environments, and Cleveland's environment has ruined more than it's refined. This is why insiders keep framing Harbaugh's interest as conditional rather than opportunistic. He's not chasing a job, he's setting terms. And the fact that Cleveland is even being mentioned as a possibility suggests something has shifted internally. The uncomfortable truth is this: the Browns don't just need a new coach, they need a new chain of command. And that kind of change only happens when ownership believes the cost of staying the same is higher than the risk of blowing everything up. That's the crossroads Cleveland is approaching, not because of one insider report, but because the combination of Shedeur's presence and Harbaugh's leverage forces a decision they can't keep delaying. And once that tension reaches a certain point, something has to give. Here's the part that makes this entire situation feel less crazy than it sounds. The Cleveland Browns don't have the luxury of patience anymore. Not with their fan base, not with their locker room, and definitely not with the league watching from the outside. For decades, Cleveland has tried to fix its problems incrementally. Small adjustments, safe hires, shared authority. The result has been the same cycle on repeat. A brief spike of optimism followed by collapse, finger-pointing, and another reset. At some point, franchises stop asking what's reasonable and start asking what's left. That's why the idea of giving John Harbaugh everything he's asking for doesn't immediately get laughed out of the room. Ownership understands something critical. If this fails under Harbaugh, it fails loudly, clearly, and decisively. There's no ambiguity about who's in charge. No hiding behind internal disagreements or mixed messaging. Accountability becomes direct, and in some strange way, that's appealing for a franchise that's been drowning in blurred responsibility. There's also the reality that Cleveland needs credibility, not internally, externally. Players around the league talk, coaches talk, agents talk, and the Browns' reputation has made it harder to attract top-tier leadership without overpaying or overpromising. Harbaugh brings instant legitimacy. His presence alone changes how Cleveland is viewed in NFL circles. Now tie that to Shedeur Sanders. If the Browns believe Shedeur has the tools to be their long-term answer, surrounding him with stability becomes urgent. Quarterbacks don't get infinite chances. They either grow into structure or get swallowed by dysfunction. Cleveland knows its history. They've watched talented players regress because the environment never stopped shifting. Harbaugh represents structure with teeth, clear expectations, defined roles, a system that doesn't change every time pressure mounts. That kind of consistency is rare in Cleveland, and that rarity is exactly why it's tempting. This isn't about chasing headlines for the sake of attention. It's about realizing that conservative decisions have produced aggressive failure. And when every safe option leads to the same outcome, bold starts to feel responsible. Cleveland may never get a cleaner opportunity to reset everything at once. A proven coach, a high-profile young quarterback, a fan base desperate for direction. Those elements don't line up often. That's why this conversation hasn't died. And that's why, behind closed doors, people are asking the question they used to avoid. What if going all in is the only way out? For all the logic behind this idea, there's a reason it makes people shift in their seats. Because if the Cleveland Browns go down this road, there's no soft landing. No, we'll see how it goes. No gradual adjustment period. This would be a full-scale commitment that either changes the franchise's trajectory or detonates it. And everyone involved knows that. Handing John Harbaugh total authority would mean ownership openly admitting that their current system failed. That's not a small admission. It's a public reset of power, philosophy, and ego. Once you do that, there's no walking it back without consequences. If it works, Harbaugh becomes the most powerful figure in Cleveland football. If it fails, the fallout hits ownership first. Then there's the part nobody wants to talk about out loud: optics. Every decision would be dissected through one lens: Shedeur Sanders. If he struggles, critics won't just blame development or scheme. They'll blame favoritism. They'll scream nepotism. They'll question whether the organization ever had objectivity. That noise would be relentless, and it wouldn't fade with time. That pressure wouldn't just affect Shedeur. It would affect the locker room. Veterans don't care about headlines, but they care about fairness. Harbaugh would have to manage egos, expectations, and trust at a level even experienced NFL coaches rarely face. One misstep, one perception of special treatment, and cracks form fast. There's also the reality that college success doesn't guarantee NFL translation. Harbaugh has the resume, but the league is unforgiving. Schemes evolve faster. Players push back harder. Authority is tested daily. And coaching your own son under those conditions multiplies every challenge. That's why this isn't a no-brainer for anyone. Not Cleveland, not Harbaugh, not the Sanders family. But here's what keeps the door open. The Browns have already failed quietly, repeatedly. Safe decisions didn't protect them from embarrassment, they prolonged it. And in the NFL, prolonged failure is worse than a dramatic one. At least a bold move creates clarity. This is the paradox Cleveland is facing. The move that scares them the most is also the one that finally draws a clean line between past and future. No half measures, no blurred authority, just one vision, owned completely. That's why the risk hasn't killed the conversation. It's intensified it. Because sometimes the most dangerous decision isn't making a bold move. It's convincing yourself you can survive by staying exactly the same. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough, but it might be the most important piece of this entire situation. Timing. Because in the NFL, opportunity doesn't wait for comfort, and Cleveland is running out of time to pretend this decision can be pushed down the road. The Browns aren't operating in a vacuum. Other teams are watching. Other coaching openings are forming, and John Harbaugh isn't going to sit in limbo forever. Insiders have already mentioned multiple potential landing spots outside of Cleveland, teams with cleaner structures and fewer question marks. If Cleveland hesitates too long, the option disappears entirely. At the same time, Shedeur Sanders is entering the most delicate phase of his career. This is the stretch where young quarterbacks either get stabilized or slowly eroded by uncertainty. Changing systems, changing voices, changing expectations. Cleveland has seen how quickly confidence can slip when the environment doesn't commit. That's why this moment feels compressed. If the Browns wait a full season, they risk wasting valuable development time. If they rush, they risk making a catastrophic mistake. But here, the reality insiders keep hinting at, doing nothing is still a choice, and it comes with consequences. Every week Shedeur plays under an unclear future, the questions grow louder. Is he the guy? Is the staff aligned with him? Is the organization building around him or just buying time? Those questions don't stay external. They creep into locker rooms. They affect preparation. They shape perception among players and agents across the league. Cleveland's leadership understands that once doubt sets in internally, it's almost impossible to reverse. That's why decisive franchises act early, even when certainty isn't complete. They choose a direction and live with it. This is where the Harbaugh angle becomes more than just an attractive idea. He represents immediacy, a clear hierarchy, a defined vision. Whether people like his demands or not, they eliminate ambiguity. And ambiguity is what has killed Cleveland more than bad talent evaluations ever did. The Browns are starring at a rare convergence. A high-profile quarterback already driving attention, a proven coach potentially available, a fan base desperate for clarity instead of promises. Those windows don't stay open long. That's why this situation feels like it's accelerating instead of cooling off. Because once timing becomes the pressure point, franchises don't ask whether a move is comfortable. They ask whether they'll regret not taking it when they had the chance. This is no longer just an off-season rumor or a talk radio fantasy. This is a moment of reckoning for the Cleveland Browns, and moments like this don't come around often. Franchises usually drift into decisions over time. Cleveland doesn't have that luxury anymore. Everything has converged at once. A high-profile young quarterback in Shedeur Sanders who already commands attention before proving anything. A fan base exhausted by half measures and recycled explanations. And the very real possibility of a proven Super Bowl winning coach in John Harbaugh who isn't asking to fix the Browns, he's asking to reshape them entirely. That's what makes this moment so uncomfortable and so important. Cleveland has spent decades convincing itself that patience and process would eventually pay off, that the next coordinator, the next quarterback, the next tweak would finally break the cycle. It hasn't. What's different now is that the Browns aren't choosing between good options and bad ones. They're choosing between conviction and hesitation. If they pass on a move like this, they're signaling that they're still afraid of being wrong, afraid of optics, afraid of noise, afraid of being judged for trying something bold and failing publicly. But the truth is, Cleveland has already failed publicly, just slowly, quietly, and repeatedly. On the other side of that fear is alignment, a clear hierarchy, a defined vision, a commitment to building around a quarterback instead of cycling through them. That doesn't guarantee success. Nothing in the NFL does. But it does guarantee clarity, and clarity is something this franchise has lacked for generations. This isn't about hype or headlines. It's about whether Cleveland finally chooses to stop surviving season to season and start building towards something concrete. Whether they trust themselves enough to make a decision that changes everything, instead of delaying one that changes nothing. No matter what happens next, this much is clear. The Browns are standing at a crossroads they can't ignore. One path keeps them safe, familiar, and stuck. The other is risky, loud, and transformative. And for the first time in a long time, Cleveland doesn't get to pretend this choice doesn't exist. If you're waiting for this story to fade, it probably won't. Not because of leaks or hot takes, but because the next few weeks will quietly answer questions Cleveland has avoided for years. The signs won't come from press conferences. They'll come from behavior. Watch how the Browns talk about Shedeur Sanders after his next start. Not the cliches, the specifics. Are coaches emphasizing protection and continuity, or are they hedging with language about competition and flexibility? That distinction matters. Teams that believe start tightening the circle. Teams that don't keep exits open. Watch the staff decisions. If assistants with overlapping philosophies are retained, that signals caution. If roles get clarified or redefined, that signals alignment. Franchises don't announce direction. They telegraph it through structure. And keep an eye on what doesn't happen. Silence can be louder than denial. If Cleveland doesn't rush to shut down speculation about John Harbaugh, that's not an accident. That's optionality. It means they're not ready to close a door they might need. For Harbaugh, timing cuts both ways. The longer Cleveland stays in the conversation, the more leverage he has. Multiple openings create options, but only one creates maximum control. If he's truly interested, you'll see patience from his camp, not urgency. Power waits. This is also where the league starts to lean in. Agents pay attention to alignment. Players notice stability. Coaches talk. If Cleveland looks decisive, one way or the other, it changes how the Browns are discussed in rooms that matter. Indecision, on the other hand, reinforces every stereotype they're trying to outrun. None of this guarantees a blockbuster hire. None of it guarantees Shedeur becomes the long-term answer. But it does guarantee one thing. Cleveland is being forced to choose a philosophy, not just a coach. That's the real shift here. For years, the Browns chased fixes. Now they're staring at frameworks. Either commit to a unified vision with teeth, or keep rotating parts and hoping the noise dies down. It won't. So don't look for headlines to tell you what's next. Look for patterns. Look for alignment. Look for who's empowered and who isn't. Because when a franchise finally decides who it wants to be, the rest follows fast. And if Cleveland hesitates, the league won't wait. This is the kind of crossroads franchises don't recognize until it's already passed them by. For the Cleveland Browns, this moment isn't loud or ceremonial. There's no press release announcing it, no banner moment, but it's real and it's pressing in from every direction. At the center of it all is Shedeur Sanders, not because he's already delivered wins, but because he's changed the conversation. Cleveland hasn't had that in years. A quarterback who pulls national attention into a franchise that usually only gets noticed when things fall apart. Whether people admit it or not, that matters. Attention creates pressure. Pressure forces decisions. And now the Browns are staring at a choice. They can't dance around much longer. Do they continue doing what they've always done? Slow decisions, shared authority, careful messaging. Hopping stability magically appears. Or do they lean into alignment, accept the noise, and make a move that finally draws a hard line between past and future? That's where John Harbaugh enters the conversation with real weight. Not as a rumor, not as a savior, but as a symbol of clarity. His reported demands aren't about ego. They're about control, accountability, and removing the internal friction that's quietly sabotaged Cleveland for decades. You either believe in that model or you don't. But once the question is asked, ignoring it becomes its own answer. The uncomfortable truth is this: Cleveland has already tried the safe path over and over, And it hasn't protected them from embarrassment or failure. It's only prolonged it. That's why this moment feels different, not hopeful, not exciting, necessary. If Shedeur shows composure, even without fireworks, the Browns won't be able to pretend they're starting from zero anymore. They'll have something in hand. And once that happens, hesitation becomes riskier than action. Because young quarterbacks don't develop in uncertainty. They either get supported or slowly undone by it. This isn't about guaranteeing success. Nothing in the NFL comes with guarantees. It's about choosing a direction and owning it fully, instead of living in the gray area where accountability disappears. Cleveland doesn't need another explanation. It needs a decision. And whether they like it or not, that decision is getting closer by the week.